Most killers hide behind excuses, a bad childhood, a mental illness, a moment of rage. But Carl Panzram, he didn't care. He knew he was evil, and he loved every second of it. Born in 1891, Panzram spent most of his life in and out of prisons and reform schools where he endured beatings, starvation, and abuse. But instead of breaking him, it turned him into a remorseless monster. By his own admission, he murdered at least 22 people and raped over 1,000 men, and committed countless robberies and arsons across America, Europe, and Africa. He wasn't just violent, he enjoyed it. His words? "I love to kill people. I love to see them die. I would kill the whole world if I could." Even in prison, he attacked guards, fought inmates, and even tried to kill a prison worker, who treated him kindly just because he felt like it. In 1930, he was sentenced to death. His last words before execution: "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." Panzram died with no remorse, no last-minute apologies, just pure, unfiltered hate. The next serial killer wasn't the kind of man you'd cross the street to avoid. He was the one you'd help to carry groceries, the one your parents could trust you with. And that's exactly how he got away with it. Ted Bundy didn't look like a killer. He didn't act like one either. And that's why for years, no one suspected a thing. In the 1970s, Bundy targeted young women, often pretending to be injured, wearing a fake cast, or using crutches, just to lure his victims into helping him. Once they were alone, the mask would drop. Bundy kidnapped, raped, and murdered at least 30 women. But experts believe the real number is much higher. His crimes were sadistic, calculated, and fueled by a cold, narcissistic hunger for power. But what makes Bundy even more terrifying? He escaped prison twice. The first time, he jumped from a courthouse window. The second, he squeezed through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell, and during his time on the run, he killed again. Bundy was finally caught in Florida in 1978. During his trial, he represented himself, turning the courtroom into his stage. But justice won in the end. In 1989, he was executed in the electric chair. His final words? "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." But love was something our next killer never understood. What he craved was control. Jeffrey Dahmer. He took things to a level so disturbing, it's almost beyond human understanding, and they did a Netflix show on it, and I couldn't finish the thing. It was that disturbing. Dahmer's killing spree lasted over a decade, from 1978 to 1991. His victims were young men, mostly from marginalized communities. He lured them in with promises of money, jobs, drinks, or even just friendly company. But once they were inside his apartment, they were trapped. Dahmer didn't just kill, he experimented. He dismembered his victims, took gruesome trophies, and even attempted to create living zombies by drilling holes into their skulls and pouring acid inside. He wanted complete control over his victims even after they were dead. And yes, he ate parts of them too. Oh, this is so gross. The horror of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes was only discovered when one of his victims managed to escape and flag down the police. What they found inside his apartment? A nightmare. Human remains in his fridge, skulls on display, photographs of his victims in various stages of dissection. Let me say that again, dissection. What the frick? Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison, but he wouldn't serve it for long. In 1994, he was beaten to death by another inmate. Some say it was karma, others believe true evil can never really die. But while Dahmer's crimes were monstrous, the man we're about to discuss next, he was a predator hiding in plain sight, a man who made people laugh while bearing his darkest secret. A fun-loving clown at a kid's party, a respected businessman, a man who gives back to his community. Now imagine that same man is hiding 29 bodies under his house. John Wayne Gacy was the definition of a double life. By day, he was a model citizen in Chicago. By night, he was luring young men, sometimes with the promise of work, sometimes by sheer force, before torturing, sexually assaulting, and murdering them. Gacy's preferred method? The rope trick. He would strangle his victims with a rope while tightening it using a piece of wood, enjoying every second of their suffering. For years, he got away with it. His victims, mostly teenage boys, simply vanished. Until one day in 1978. Police searched his home and made an unbelievable discovery, a mass grave beneath his floorboards. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders, one of the highest confirmed body counts in U.S. history. And yet, even in prison, he showed zero remorse. His final words before his execution in 1994, "Kiss my ass." But Gacy's crimes, as horrifying as they were, didn't even compare to the man who inspired some of Hollywood's most infamous horror villains. Ever wonder where the horror movies get their creepiest ideas? Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, they all have one thing in common: Ed Gein. Gein wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. He had only 2 confirmed victims, but what truly made him terrifying was what he did with their bodies. Raised by a fanatically religious mother who convinced him that all women were evil, Gein lived a reclusive life on a farm in Wisconsin, but inside his home, a house of horrors. When police searched his property in 1957, they found human skin stitched into furniture, skulls turned into bowls, and a lampshade made from a human face, and a suit made entirely of women's skin. Gein had been digging up graves for years, collecting body parts to craft his own twisted creations. His reason? He was trying to make a woman suit to become his mother. Gein was declared insane and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, but his crimes, they became legendary. His twisted mind shaped some of the most disturbing villains in pop culture, proving that sometimes reality is far scarier than fiction. Imagine sleeping peacefully in your bed. Then, in the dead of night, you wake up to a dark figure standing at the foot of your bed. His breath smells of rot, his eyes empty, and then he smiles. This was the Night Stalker signature. Richard Ramirez, a self-proclaimed Satanist, terrorized California in the mid-1980s with a killing spree so random and sadistic it felt like something out of a horror movie. His victims ranged from young children to elderly couples. He didn't have a pattern. He simply broke into homes at night, murdering men, sexually assaulting women, and torturing his victims for fun. Sometimes he'd leave satanic symbols behind. Other times he'd force survivors to swear their allegiance to the devil. Ramirez was a monster who thrived on chaos. He had zero remorse, even flashing a grin during his trial, revealing his rotting teeth. And when he was sentenced to death, his response? Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland. But if Ramirez was evil personified, the next man on our list was a predator personified. Some serial killers take dozens of lives, some even more. But Pedro Alonso Lopez, he slaughtered hundreds, and if he hadn't been caught, the number could have been thousands. Lopez was born into violence. Raised in Colombia, he was kicked out of his home at a young age and turned to crime just to survive. But by the time he was an adult, he had developed a horrific addiction to murder. His victims, little girls. From the 1970s to early 1980s, Lopez targeted and killed over 300 young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He was a ghost, moving from town to town, avoiding capture. He would lure children away, assault them, then strangle them slowly, watching the life drain from their eyes with no emotion. When he was finally caught, he led police to mass graves, rows and rows of small bodies, discarded like trash. But the most disturbing part, he was released after serving only 14 years in Ecuador because of weak sentencing laws. Are you kidding me? Oh my gosh, that's just not right. Lopez was deported to Colombia. He was later arrested again, and then vanished. To this day, his whereabouts remain unknown. While Lopez preyed on children, our next killer was a man whose pleasure came from pain. So much so that he earned the nickname the Rostov Ripper. In Soviet Russia, authorities refused to believe serial killers existed. It was a Western problem. They are Russian, nothing happens there. But Andrei Chikatilo proved them wrong in the worst way possible. Chikatilo wasn't just a killer, he was a sadist. From 1978 to 1990, he slaughtered at least 53 people. Men, women, children, whoever he could get his hands on. But what made his crimes truly horrifying, he didn't just kill his victims. He butchered them. Chikatilo mutilated bodies, gouged out eyes, bit off tongues, and removed genitals, all the while satisfying his twisted, uncontrollable urges. His methods were so grotesque that even the hardened investigators struggled to look at the crime scenes. For years, he evaded capture, even passing lie detector tests. But in 1990, he made a mistake. Police spotted him acting suspiciously near a train station. When they finally arrested him and matched his DNA to the crimes, he confessed in chilling detail, describing each murder with eerie detachment. At his trial, he was placed in a steel cage to protect him from the enraged families of his victims. His last words before execution, "Don't blow my brains out. The Japanese want to buy them." Now, there are killers who terrify, there are killers who disgust, and then there's Albert Fish, arguably one of the most disturbing murderers of all time. Fish wasn't just a child killer. He was a cannibal, a masochist, monster in human form. Active in the early 1900s, Fish roamed New York, preying on young children. He lured them in with sweets, money, or the promise of a meal, only to torture, kill, and eat them. But what made Fish truly horrifying was the letter he sent to the family of one of his victims, 10-year-old Grace Budd. In it, he detailed exactly how he murdered her, how he cooked her body, and how he enjoyed every bite. The letter was so graphic, it even left hardened detectives physically sick. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, Fish was also a self-torturer. When police arrested him, they discovered he had needles lodged inside his pelvis, needles he had inserted himself. He showed zero remorse, claiming God had commanded him to kill. In 1936, he was sentenced to death by electric chair, and his last words, "I don't even know why I'm here." Well, for the last one, imagine waking up, you're chained to a bed, a voice crackles through a speaker saying, "Hello there, B-word, you're mine now." And that's how it begins for dozens of victims. David Parker Ray wasn't your typical serial killer. He didn't just kill, he enslaved. Operating in New Mexico in the 1990s, Ray built a torture chamber inside a soundproof trailer, what he called the toy box. Inside were whips, chains, surgical tools, and devices designed for one purpose: inflicting pain. He would abduct women, drug them, then brainwash them using audio recordings, forcing them to believe they were his slaves, training them through torture. Some he would kill, others he'd release, so broken they wouldn't remember a thing. Despite over 60 suspected victims, Ray was never formally convicted of murder. Because he was careful, no bodies were ever found. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison, but before he could serve his time, he died of a heart attack. And with him, the truth about his victims was buried forever.